Tales of the American frontier often speak of gunslingers, lawmen, and outlaws, their legends carved into the dusty pages of history. But perhaps none are more intriguing than the story of Marcus Swift-Hand Chen, a traveling merchant whose unassuming presence masked one of the deadliest pistol hands west of the Mississippi. In the autumn of 1875, his reputation would be forged in blood and gun smoke, forever changing how the territories viewed the quiet men who walked their streets. Join me today as we delve into the remarkable tale of the merchant who became a legend, proving that appearances can be dangerously deceiving. And if this story touches your soul, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale will leave you breathless. Silver Creek Trading Post, Dakota Territory, 1875. The settlement was little more than a collection of weather-beaten buildings huddled against the prairie wind, a place where the civilized world met the untamed wilderness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the muddy street as a heavily laden wagon rolled into town, its wheels creaking under the weight of traded goods and mysterious cargo. At the reins sat Marcus Chen, a figure who seemed out of place in the rugged frontier. His clothes were finely made, but practical, his manner reserved yet confident. Those who witnessed his arrival would later recall two distinct details: the peculiar way his coat was cut, slightly longer on the right side, and the strange wooden box that never left his side. Sheriff Tom Bradley watched the newcomer from his office porch, 30 years of law enforcement having taught him to read men like wanted posters. "There's something different about this one," he muttered to his deputy, James Cooper. "Way he sits that wagon, way his eyes keep moving. That ain't no ordinary merchant." The trading post's owner, Sarah McAllister, a widow who'd built her business from nothing after her husband's death, was the first to engage with Chen. "You're a long way from San Francisco," she observed, noting the characters painted on some of his crates. Chen smiled softly, his English perfect but accented. "The best opportunities," he replied, "often lie where others fear to tread." What Sarah couldn't know, what none of them could know, was that Marcus Chen had chosen Silver Creek for a reason. The settlement lay at the crossroads of several major trading routes, and rumors had been spreading about a gang that preyed on merchants in the territory. The Blackwater Riders, they called themselves, led by the notorious James Blackjack Morrison, had left a trail of robbed and murdered traders stretching from Montana to Nebraska. But there was something else about Chen that the good people of Silver Creek couldn't have guessed. The way he moved, fluid and deliberate, spoke of years of training. The wooden box he carried, ornately carved with Chinese characters, contained more than just ledgers and accounts. And those eyes constantly scanning weren't just looking for trade opportunities. Deputy Cooper, young and eager to prove himself, approached Chen as the merchant began unloading his wagon. "Might want to be careful, Mr. Chen," he warned, trying to be helpful. "We've had troubles with raiders lately, especially with independent traders." Chen paused in his work, fixing the deputy with a calm gaze. "Thank you for your concern," he replied quietly. "But I have found that trouble often finds more than it bargains for." There was something in his voice, a steel beneath the silk, that made Cooper step back involuntarily. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie sky in shades of amber and gold, word of the new merchant's arrival had already spread beyond Silver Creek. In a hidden camp 15 miles outside town, a rider delivered the news to Blackjack Morrison himself. The gang leader, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his cunning, smiled as he listened to the report. "A lone Chinese merchant?" he mused, cleaning his revolver by firelight. "Sounds like an easy mark." But one of his men, an old hand named Tucker, who'd survived 20 years on the frontier, wasn't so sure. "Something ain't right, boss," he muttered. "Way Jenkins tells it, this merchant's too calm, too sure of himself." Morrison laughed, the sound carrying no warmth. "Since when did you start believing in fairy tales, Tucker?" "One man, one wagon. What could possibly go wrong?" What indeed? As night fell over Silver Creek, Marcus Chen sat in his rented room above the trading post, methodically cleaning a weapon few in the territories had ever seen. Tomorrow would bring business, perhaps violence, and Chen intended to be ready for both. After all, he hadn't come to Silver Creek simply to trade goods. He'd come to set a trap, and the Blackwater riders were about to discover that some prey bites back. The story I'm about to share took us considerable time to research and verify, so if you're finding value in it, please consider subscribing to our channel. Now let's return to Silver Creek and the unfolding tale of Marcus Chen. Dawn broke over the Dakota Territory like a watercolor painting, casting long shadows across Silver Creek's main street. Marcus Chen began his day early, arranging his goods with methodical precision in the space he'd rented next to McAllister's trading post. Those who watched him work noticed how he positioned everything to maintain clear sightlines to both the street and the door, though few understood the significance. Sarah McAllister, bringing him a cup of coffee, found herself studying the mysterious merchant more closely. His movements were too precise, too measured for a simple trader. "My late husband was a cavalryman," she said carefully, setting down the cup. "He moved the way you do, always aware, always ready." Chen's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the mask of the humble merchant slipped. "Your husband was a wise man," he replied softly. "In my experience, readiness often means the difference between life and death." He paused, then added, "Especially in places where law and civilization are still finding their roots." The morning brought curious townspeople, drawn by word of exotic goods from San Francisco and beyond. Chen dealt with them graciously, his manner impeccable, his business sense sharp. But Sheriff Bradley, watching from across the street, noticed how the merchant's right hand never strayed far from that wooden box of his. "Been asking around about our new friend," Deputy Cooper reported, joining his boss on the walkway. "Telegraph operator got word back from California. Says there's stories about a Chinese merchant out there, one who dealt with the Tong gangs in Frisco's Chinatown. They called him the Ghost Merchant. Seems trouble followed him, but he always came out alive. Those who started the trouble didn't." Bradley chewed on this information like tough beef. "Any warrants? Any reason to run him out of town?" "That's the strange thing," Cooper replied, lowering his voice. "Every incident was ruled self-defense. Clean kills, witnesses all saying the other fellow drew first. But the numbers, boss. 15 men in 3 years. All of them known gunmen or criminals." Inside his temporary shop, Chen was showing a bolt of fine silk to Eleanor Watson, the banker's wife, when he noticed 3 rough-looking men entering town. They moved with the casual arrogance of predators, gun belts riding low, spurs jingling against the wooden walkway. His eyes narrowed slightly. Advanced scouts for the Blackwater riders, testing the waters. The leader of the 3, a scarred man named Hawkins, made a show of browsing Chen's goods while his companions positioned themselves near the exits. "Fine things you got here," Hawkins drawled, running calloused fingers over a displayed revolver. "Must be worth a small fortune." "Everything has its price," Chen replied evenly, noting how the other 2 men were subtly herding the remaining customers out. "Though some prices are higher than others might expect." Hawkins smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Way I hear it, roads ain't safe these days. Shame if something were to happen to all these pretty things." He picked up a delicate jade figurine, deliberately letting it drop. Chen's hand shot out, catching the piece before it could shatter on the floor. The movement was faster than any simple merchant should have been capable of. A tense silence filled the room. Hawkins's smile faded as he realized his attempt to provoke fear had instead revealed something dangerous. Chen's grip on the jade piece was steady, his eyes never leaving Hawkins's face. "Perhaps," the merchant said softly, "you should return when you are truly interested in trading." Word of the confrontation spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. By sundown, Tucker was reporting back to Blackjack Morrison at their hidden camp. "Boss, I'm telling you, something ain't right about this one. Hawkins says he moved like lightning, and you know Hawkins ain't given to exaggeration." Morrison, however, had already made up his mind. The presence of a wealthy merchant, especially one who seemed capable of defending himself, had wounded his pride. "Tomorrow," he announced to his gathered men, "we remind folks why the Blackwater Riders rule these territories. And this Chinese merchant? He's about to learn that all the fancy moves in the world don't mean shit against 30 guns." But back in town, Sarah McAllister was making a discovery that would have given even Morrison pause. Looking out her window well after midnight, she saw Chen in the moonlight behind his shop, practicing what appeared to be a dance. His hands moved in fluid patterns, drawing and releasing an unusual-looking pistol with supernatural speed. The weapon seemed to disappear and reappear in his grip like magic, each movement precise, each stance perfect. She remembered stories her husband had told her about his time in California, tales of Chinese martial artists who had adapted their ancient techniques to modern weapons. Looking at Chen now, those stories suddenly seemed less like frontier myths and more like warnings. The chill of dawn still clung to Silver Creek when Sarah McAllister made her way to Chen's shop. What she'd witnessed in the moonlight had stirred memories she'd rather have left buried. Her husband hadn't just told her stories about Chinese martial artists. He'd shown her sketches, detailed notes about their techniques, particularly one school that had revolutionized the way of the gun. "The snake's fang," she said without preamble as Chen opened his door. "That's what you were practicing last night, wasn't it? The art of the lightning draw." The merchant's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. He gestured for her to enter, closing the door behind them. "Your husband's notes were very detailed," Chen said quietly, removing the wooden box from its shelf. "Captain James McAllister was one of the few Westerners who understood what we were trying to achieve." He opened the box, revealing an intricately crafted revolver unlike any Sarah had seen before. The barrel was shorter than standard, the grip modified with strange wooden extensions. "The snake's fang isn't just about speed," Chen explained, lifting the weapon. "It's about turning your opponent's aggression against them. When multiple attackers strike, they expect their numbers to be their strength. Instead, their very coordination becomes their weakness." Sarah studied the merchant's face. "You're not here by chance, are you? The Blackwater Riders. You've been hunting them." "Not hunting," Chen corrected softly. "Waiting. They've killed 12 merchants in the past year. 3 were friends of mine, good men with families in San Francisco. The law can't touch them, not with their numbers and connections. So we decided on a different approach." "We?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The Merchants Guild has its own ways of dealing with threats," Chen replied. "Sometimes a sword must hide within silk." Outside, Silver Creek was coming to life. Deputy Cooper, making his morning rounds, noticed more rough-looking strangers arriving in town. They came in ones and twos, taking up positions in the saloon, the hotel, casual-like, but too coordinated for coincidence. Sheriff Bradley saw it too. "Morrison's getting ready to move," he told Cooper. "Get word to the outlying farms. Women and children need to clear out until this is settled." But when Cooper approached Chen's shop to warn him, he found the merchant already preparing. Gone were the fine silks and delicate pottery. The displays had been rearranged, creating clear lanes of fire. Strategic spots had been marked with subtle chalk lines on the floor. "You should leave too," Chen told the deputy. "What's coming isn't your fight." Cooper straightened his back. "With respect, Mr. Chen, anything that happens in Silver Creek is my fight. Sheriff Bradley feels the same." A ghost of a smile touched Chen's lips. "Then let me show you something that might help you survive what's coming." He reached into his box, removing a second modified revolver. "These were designed for the Imperial Guards of China, before the West forced open our ports. Watch carefully. This technique could save your life." For the next hour, as tension built in the streets outside, Chen taught Cooper the basics of what he called the dragon's scales, a defensive technique that used minimal movement for maximum effect. The deputy was a quick study, though he couldn't match Chen's supernatural speed. "Remember," Chen instructed, "when multiple attackers come, they expect you to be overwhelmed, to panic. Their confidence is their weakness. Their coordination becomes predictable." At noon, Tucker rode into town under a white flag. He carried Blackjack Morrison's message. The merchant had 1 hour to surrender his goods and leave town, or the Blackwater riders would come and take everything, including his life. Chen's response was simple. "Tell Mr. Morrison I'll be waiting. Some lessons can only be taught with blood." Before we dive back into the story of Silver Creek, consider subscribing to our channel if you're enjoying this tale. Your support helps us bring more incredible stories like this to life. Now, let's return to that fateful day in 1875. Tucker's ride back to the Blackwater Riders' camp was troubled, his mind replaying the merchant's response. In 20 years of riding with outlaws, he'd seen men face death with courage, with fear, with bravado, but never with such calm certainty. The merchant's eyes had reminded him of a rattlesnake's, patient, deadly, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "He ain't backing down, boss," Tucker reported to Morrison. "Said he'd be waiting. Something about teaching lessons with blood." He hesitated, then added, "Maybe we should reconsider." Hit one of the supply wagons coming up from... Morrison's backhand caught him across the face, sending him sprawling. "You getting soft, old man? One Chinese merchant's got you spooked?" The gang leader stood, addressing his assembled men. 30 guns against 1. Even if he's as good as Tucker thinks, ain't no man alive can stand against those odds. Back in Silver Creek, Chen was making final preparations. He'd moved his wagon behind McAllister's trading post, positioning it to create a natural bottleneck. Inside his shop, every crate and display had been carefully arranged to provide cover, while channeling attackers into killing zones. Sarah watched him work, noting how each movement seemed part of a larger plan. "My husband's journals," she said suddenly. There was something else in them, about a massacre in San Francisco's Chinatown. 3 years ago, 20 Tong fighters were found dead in a warehouse. The only survivor described a merchant who moved like living smoke. Chen paused in his preparations. 27, he corrected quietly. They had taken a family hostage, a family under my protection. His hands moved unconsciously, checking his modified revolvers. That was when I learned that sometimes the best way to honor ancient traditions is to adapt them. Sheriff Bradley entered the shop, his weathered face grave. "Got 3 more of Morrison's men in town, trying to spook folks, make them pressure you to leave." He studied the merchant's preparations with professional interest. "You've done this before. Set up ambush points, created kill zones." "In my experience," Chen replied, "surviving the first wave of an attack is only the beginning. It's what comes after, when they're angry and desperate, that determines who lives and who dies." Deputy Cooper had been practicing the defensive techniques Chen had shown him, his movements becoming smoother with each repetition. "Boss," he called to Bradley, "you need to see this." He demonstrated the basic form of the dragon scales, showing how a single fluid motion could provide coverage against multiple attackers. Bradley's eyes widened slightly. "That's why you position yourself this way," he said to Chen. "You're not just looking for cover, you're creating channels they have to follow, making their attacks predictable." "The basis of the snake's fang style," Chen confirmed. "Turn their numbers against them. Make them cluster, stumble over each other. In confined spaces, 30 men can be more vulnerable than 3. As the hour of Morrison's deadline approached, tension in Silver Creek reached a breaking point. Most civilians had evacuated, leaving behind a ghost town of empty buildings and wind-blown streets. Chen stood in his shop's doorway, watching the sun climb toward its zenith, his modified revolvers loaded and ready. Sarah approached him one last time, carrying a worn journal. "Take it," she said, holding out her husband's notes. "If you survive this, there are others who should know these techniques. Men who will use them to protect, not destroy. Chen accepted the journal with a respectful nod. Your husband was an honorable man, Mrs. McAllister. I'll ensure his knowledge serves honor. He turned back to the street, where the first dust clouds of approaching riders were becoming visible on the horizon. Now, please take cover. It's time to teach the Blackwater Riders why some legends are born in blood. The Blackwater Riders appeared like a dark tide on the horizon, their approach deliberate and methodical. Blackjack Morrison had arranged his men in a wide formation, spreading them across the entire width of Silver Creek's main street. He'd learned from experience that a concentrated charge could be turned against the defenders, better to overwhelm them from all sides. Remember, Morrison called out to his men, first wave hits hard, draws his fire. Second wave comes in while he's reloading. Nobody plays hero. Nobody tries to prove anything. We do this smart. We do this right. Inside his shop, Chen listened to the approaching thunder of hooves with practiced calm. His modified revolvers rested in specially designed holsters, the grips positioned for the lightning draw of the snake's fang style. Next door, Sheriff Bradley and Deputy Cooper had taken up defensive positions, their own weapons ready. Last chance to walk away, Chen called out to them. This isn't your battle. Bradley chambered a round in his Winchester. Way I see it, Mr. Chen, any man who stands against Morrison and his kind is a friend of the law. Besides, he added with a grim smile, been waiting 3 years to see these bastards get what's coming to them. The first shots came from Morrison's advanced scouts, wild firing meant to pin down the defenders and reveal their positions. Bullets splintered wood and shattered windows, but Chen remained motionless, waiting. He'd positioned himself perfectly, using the morning sun to his advantage. Anyone trying to draw a bead on him would be shooting into the glare. Riding in! The cry went up as the first wave of Blackwater Riders thundered into town, 15 men charging at full gallop. They expected to overwhelm the defenders with sheer momentum, to find them cowering behind cover. Instead, they found death waiting with mathematical precision. Chen's hands moved with supernatural speed, the snake's fang style turning his body into living smoke. His modified revolvers spoke with controlled fury, each shot finding its mark with devastating accuracy. 3 riders fell before they realized they were under fire, 2 more as they tried to rein in their horses. Sweet Jesus, Cooper breathed, watching Chen's display. The merchant seemed to flow between positions, using the doorways and windows he'd prepared as firing points. Each movement was economical, each shot precise. The remaining riders of the first wave found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire, as Bradley and Cooper added their own carefully aimed shots to the chaos. Morrison, watching from the town's edge, felt his first flicker of doubt. 8 men down in the first 30 seconds, and he still couldn't get a clear look at the merchant. Chen seemed to anticipate each attack, each attempt to flank his position. The shop's interior, carefully arranged beforehand, turned every charge into a death trap. Second wave, Morrison bellowed, sending in 10 more riders. But this time Chen was ready with a surprise. As the riders charged, he triggered a mechanism he'd prepared, sending a cascade of barrels rolling into the street. Horses reared and stumbled, throwing their riders into the dust. In the confusion, Chen's revolver spoke again, the dragon scales technique allowing him to maintain perfect coverage while advancing. He's not just shooting, Tucker realized, watching in horror. He's hurting us. Every shot, every move, it's all planned. We're dancing to his tune. Morrison's face twisted with rage. Enough games. Everyone in. Full attack. We'll bury him under our numbers. But as the remaining Blackwater riders prepared to charge, a strange sound cut through the gunsmoke. Chen's laughter, soft and deadly. Come then. His voice carried on the wind. Come and learn why the snake's fang is feared even among the warriors of my homeland. The real battle for Silver Creek was about to begin, and the legend of the ghost merchant was about to be written in blood and gunsmoke. If you're finding this tale of the ghost merchant captivating, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support enables us to continue bringing these forgotten legends to light. Now, let's return to the smoke-filled streets of Silver Creek. The remaining Blackwater riders charged as one, their horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth of Silver Creek's main street. Morrison had abandoned subtlety for overwhelming force, hoping to drown the merchant in a tide of lead and steel. 20 men, all hardened killers, converged on Chen's position from multiple angles. What followed would be talked about in whispers for decades to come. Chen moved like water through his carefully prepared killing ground, the snake's fang style making him seem to materialize and vanish between heartbeats. His modified revolvers sang a deadly duet, each shot finding its mark with surgical precision. He never fired at center mass. Instead, he disabled his opponents with carefully placed shots to shoulders, arms, and legs. He's not trying to kill them, Cooper realized, watching in amazement from his position. He's crippling them, making examples. The deputy's own gun barked, taking down a rider who'd tried to flank Chen's position. Morrison, now in the thick of the fight, began to understand the true genius of Chen's preparations. The merchant had transformed the entire street into an elaborate trap. Every attempt to rush his position was met with precisely placed obstacles. Every flanking maneuver led into pre-sighted killing zones. It wasn't just skill with a gun, it was tactical mastery on a level few had ever witnessed. "Behind you!" Sarah shouted from her vantage point in the trading post's upper window. Chen didn't even turn. He simply shifted his weight, his body flowing like silk in the wind. Two riders who'd thought they had the drop on him found themselves shooting at empty air, as the merchant seemed to melt away from their line of fire. The dragon's scales technique proved its worth as Chen used minimal movement to maintain perfect defensive coverage while advancing. His modified revolvers never seemed to empty, each reload conducted with the same fluid grace as his shots. Later, witnesses would swear they never actually saw him reload. His hands moved too fast to follow. "What the hell are you?" Morrison screamed, firing wildly as another of his carefully planned attacks dissolved into chaos. Bodies littered the street, some dead, most wounded, all taken down with the same clinical precision. Chen's response was barely above a whisper, yet it carried clearly through the gunsmoke. "I am what you made me. When you murdered those merchants, you weren't just killing innocent men. You were awakening something ancient, something that remembers when justice wore silk and carried steel." Sheriff Bradley, who'd seen his share of gunfights, had never witnessed anything like it. The merchant moved with an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings, as if he could sense threats before they materialized. Every shot, every step, every movement was part of a deadly dance that had been choreographed centuries before guns existed. "Fall back!" Tucker screamed, watching another group of riders fall to Chen's precise fire. "For God's sake, fall back!" But Morrison, his face twisted with rage and disbelief, wouldn't hear of retreat. His reputation, his legend, was being dismantled by a single man, and his pride wouldn't let him accept defeat. "Burn him out," Morrison commanded, pulling out a stick of dynamite. "Burn the whole damn town if we have to." But as he raised his arm to throw, Chen's voice cut through the chaos like a steel blade. That would be unwise. The merchant stood in the street, smoke curling around him like living shadows. In his hands, the modified revolvers caught the sun's glare. Very unwise indeed. Time seemed to freeze in the smoke-filled street as Morrison stood with his arm cocked back, the stick of dynamite casting a long shadow in the midday sun. Around him, the remaining Blackwater riders watched in tense silence, their horses stamping nervously in the blood-stained dust. The bodies of their companions, some dead, many wounded, littered the ground like grim markers of Chen's lethal efficiency. "You think I won't do it?" Morrison snarled, his voice cracking with desperate rage. "You think I won't burn this whole town to ashes just to see you dead?" Chen's response was to shift his stance slightly, adopting a position that old masters had perfected centuries before guns existed. "I think," he said, softly, "that you're about to learn the final technique of the snake's fang style. We call it striking the dragon's heart." Tucker, who had survived 20 years of frontier violence through animal instinct, felt his blood run cold. There was something different in the merchant's voice now, something final. "Boss," he called out, "don't do it. For God's sake, look at his eyes." But Morrison was beyond reason. His legend, his very identity, was unraveling in front of his men. With a roar of defiance, he drew back his arm to throw the dynamite. And that's when Chen moved. Later, those who witnessed what followed would argue about what they actually saw. The merchant seemed to dissolve like smoke in the wind, his body flowing forward with impossible speed. Both modified revolvers spoke once, their reports blending into a single thunderclap. The first shot struck Morrison's throwing arm with surgical precision, severing tendons and sending the dynamite tumbling harmlessly into the dust. The second shot clicked the fuse itself, snuffing it out with a precision that seemed to deny the very laws of nature. Before the echo of the shots had faded, Chen materialized behind Morrison, one revolver pressed against the gang leader's spine. "The snake's fang," he explained to his stunned audience, "teaches that the deadliest strike is not always the killing blow. Sometimes the most devastating attack is the one that leaves your enemy alive to contemplate their failures." Sheriff Bradley and Deputy Cooper emerged from their positions, weapons trained on the remaining Blackwater riders. But it wasn't necessary. The fight had gone out of them. Watching their invincible leader brought low by what seemed like sorcery had broken their will to resist. 20 years, Tucker said, throwing down his gun belt. 20 years riding these territories, and I ain't never seen anything like that. What are you, mister? Really? Chen's eyes swept the street, noting how many of the wounded were still breathing, exactly as he'd planned. I am a merchant, he replied calmly, one who trades in lessons as well as goods. Today's lesson was costly, but I trust it will be remembered. Sarah McAllister, emerging from the trading post with her shotgun still ready, surveyed the aftermath with grim satisfaction. The Army patrol from Fort Harrison should be here by sundown, she announced. Seems someone sent them a telegram about the Blackwater Riders' location before all this started. Chen nodded slightly. Everything had been orchestrated, from his arrival in Silver Creek to the timing of the Army's response. The Merchants Guild had planned this trap for months, choosing the perfect location, the perfect bait, the perfect executioner. You planned all of this, Morrison whispered, his voice hollow with understanding. From the beginning. We thought we were the hunters. A simple merchant, Chen corrected him softly, selling the most valuable commodity of all, justice. His modified revolvers disappeared beneath his coat with fluid grace, the snake's fang style completing its deadly work. As the dust settled over Silver Creek, the true scope of Chen's victory became clear. The street told a story written in blood and brass. 28 Blackwater riders wounded with surgical precision, 5 dead who had left him no choice, and Blackjack Morrison himself, the notorious terror of the territories, reduced to a broken man kneeling in the dust. Dr. William Hayes, summoned from his office where he'd wisely waited out the fighting, moved among the wounded with growing amazement. I've never seen anything like these wounds, he told Sheriff Bradley. Each shot placed perfectly, disabling without killing, except where absolutely necessary. It's like he was performing surgery with a revolver. Chen helped the doctor tend to the injured, his movements as precise in healing as they had been in combat. From a hidden compartment in his wagon, he produced Chinese medicinal supplies that proved remarkably effective at treating gunshot wounds. In my culture, he explained as he worked, the warrior's path includes knowledge of both dealing and healing wounds. One cannot truly understand how to take life without also understanding how to preserve it. Deputy Cooper, helping to secure the prisoners who could still walk, couldn't contain his curiosity. Those techniques you showed me, the dragon's scales, where did they really come from? Chen paused in his work, considering his answer carefully. During the Opium Wars, when Western powers forced themselves into China, many ancient fighting schools faced a choice: adapt or die. Some masters saw firearms as beneath them, clinging to traditional weapons. Others, like my teacher, understood that the principles of our art could be applied to any weapon. Sarah McAllister appeared with fresh bandages, her own curiosity evident. And the Merchants Guild? How many others like you are there? Enough, Chen replied softly. Enough to ensure that men like Morrison think twice before preying on innocent traders. We are not vigilantes. We work within the law when possible. But where the law cannot reach, we ensure justice finds a way. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the blood-stained street, troops from Fort Harrison began arriving. Captain James Whitaker, commanding the patrol, took in the scene with professional interest. His eyes lingered on Chen's modified revolvers, recognizing something in their design. "I served in China," the captain said quietly. "Saw something like this once in Shanghai. A British merchant had tried to cheat some local traders. They found him the next morning, alive but with every major tendon severed. The wounds were so precise, the doctor said it had to be done by someone with intimate knowledge of human anatomy." Chen met his gaze steadily. "Sometimes, Captain, the most effective deterrent is not death, but living with the consequences of one's actions. Morrison and his surviving men will have plenty of time to contemplate their choices while serving their sentences." Tucker, the old outlaw who had survived by knowing when to fold a losing hand, approached Chen under guard. "All these years," he said, shaking his head, "we thought we were the wolves hunting the sheep. Never occurred to us that there might be dragons hiding among the flock." The merchant's response was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of town. 3 riders were approaching at a gallop, their clothes marking them as representatives of the Merchants Guild. Chen recognized Thomas Chen, no relation, Robert Martinez, and William Chang, other traveling merchants who, like him, ensured justice along the trading routes. "More of your kind?" Sheriff Bradley asked quietly. "The guild takes care of its own," Chen replied. "They're here to help ensure the prisoners reach Fort Harrison safely, and to—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Spread the word about today's events. After all, a lesson unshared is a lesson wasted." The arrival of the 3 guild representatives transformed the aftermath in Silver Creek from a simple cleanup into something more significant. Thomas Chen, the eldest of the 3, moved through the street with the careful eye of a man documenting every detail. Martinez examined Chen's modified revolvers with professional appreciation, while Chang began a hushed conversation with their wielder in rapid Cantonese. "They're not just here to help with the prisoners, are they?" Sarah asked Sheriff Bradley as they watched the newcomers work. The lawman shook his head slowly. "Way I reckon it," Bradley replied. "We just witnessed something bigger than taking down the Blackwater Riders. This was a message, meant to be carried far beyond our little town." He wasn't wrong. In the saloon, now converted into a temporary holding area for the less severely wounded prisoners, Thomas Chen was already interviewing witnesses, his precise handwriting filling page after page in a leather-bound journal. "The guild maintains records," Chen explained to Cooper, who had appointed himself the merchant's unofficial guardian. "Every significant encounter, every technique used, every lesson learned, all of it preserved for future generations. Today's events will be studied by apprentices for years to come." Martinez, a former Mexican cavalry officer who had found a new calling with the guild, approached with Chen's weapons in hand. "The modifications are brilliant," he said in accented English. "The balanced weight distribution, the altered grip angle. You've advanced the design since Shanghai." "Necessity breeds innovation," Chen replied modestly. "The old techniques needed adaptation for the particular challenges of the American frontier. More open spaces, longer shooting distances, different styles of combat." As they talked, Chang was organizing the collection of evidence, spent cartridges, bullet impact patterns, the precise positions where each rider had fallen. Every detail would be recorded, analyzed, and added to the guild's growing knowledge base. Captain Whitaker, observing all this with military precision, finally voiced what many were thinking. "This is more than just self-defense, isn't it? The guild is building something. A new kind of justice system operating in the shadows of the official one." Chen considered his words carefully before responding. The world is changing, Captain. The old ways of power, brute force, terror, the simple mathematics of who has the most guns, they're becoming obsolete. The Guild believes in a more precise application of force, surgical strikes that remove threats while minimizing collateral damage. Tucker, still under guard but increasingly fascinated by what he was witnessing, laughed bitterly. Surgical is right. Half my boys can't even lift a gun arm now, but they're alive to think about why they're hurting. That's some kind of terrible mercy right there. Morrison, secured in the jail's strongest cell, had fallen into a brooding silence. The notorious gang leader seemed to be grappling with how completely he had been outmaneuvered, not just tactically, but strategically. His entire operation had been dismantled by what appeared to be a simple merchant. You know what's really eating at him? Deputy Cooper observed to Chen. Not just that you beat him, but that there are more like you out there. The days of men like Morrison thinking they can rule through Ferrar. Those days are numbered. As evening approached, bringing with it the first cool breezes of the desert night, the 3 guild representatives prepared to depart. Their saddlebags were heavy with documents, sketches, and detailed accounts of the day's events. Remember, Thomas Chen told the townsfolk who had gathered to watch them leave, what happened here today wasn't just about one merchant defeating a gang. It was about showing that civilization doesn't have to be defenseless against barbarism. That justice can wear many faces, even that of a humble trader. If you're finding this tale of justice and transformation compelling, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Now let's return to Silver Creek as the sun sets on this fateful day. Word of the Blackwater Riders' defeat spread across the territory like wildfire, carried by telegraph wires and riders' tongues. In saloons from Dakota to Texas, hardened men who had lived by the gun found themselves discussing something new, the idea that the old ways of violence might be becoming obsolete in the face of a more refined, more terrible kind of justice. As military wagons arrived to transport the prisoners to Fort Harrison, Chen supervised the loading of the wounded with characteristic precision. Each man was secured according to his injuries, ensuring no further harm would come to them during the journey. It was a detail that didn't escape Captain Whitaker's notice. Even now, the captain observed, you're thinking about their well-being. After everything they've done, why show such care? Chen adjusted a bandage on one of the prisoners before responding. Because the lesson isn't just for them, Captain. Everyone watching, everyone who will hear this story, they need to understand that this isn't about revenge or cruelty. It's about precision, control, the difference between justice and vengeance. In the jail, Sheriff Bradley was conducting a final interview with Morrison before his transfer. The once feared gang leader had aged years in mere hours, his legendary confidence shattered by the realization of how completely he had been outmaneuvered. You want to know the worst part? Morrison said, his voice hollow. We thought we were the apex predators, thought our guns and our numbers made us invincible. But we were just primitive, like cavemen with clubs discovering that somewhere out there someone's invented the bow and arrow. Deputy Cooper, who had been practicing the basic forms Chen had taught him, was beginning to understand the profound shift he had witnessed. It's not just about the fighting style, is it? It's about changing how violence itself works out here. Sarah McAllister, reviewing her late husband's journals with fresh understanding, found passages that seemed prophetic. The future of the American frontier, she read aloud to Chen, will not be determined by who has the fastest draw or the most men. It will be shaped by those who understand that true power lies in the precision of its application. The merchant nodded slowly. Your husband was wise. The Guild has known for generations that as civilization advances, crude force becomes increasingly liability. The future belongs to those who can operate in the shadows between lawlessness and law. Dr. Hayes, finally finished with treating the last of the wounded, approached Chen with professional curiosity. These medical supplies you carry, the knowledge of anatomy you possess, would the Guild be interested in sharing such knowledge with frontier doctors? There's so much we could learn. That, Thomas Chen interjected, returning from a final inspection of the battle site, is precisely the kind of exchange we hope to facilitate. Medicine, commerce, justice, they're all threads in the same tapestry. As night fell over Silver Creek, the town began to recover its normal rhythm. The blood was washed from the streets, the bullet holes would soon be patched, and tomorrow's sun would rise on a settlement forever changed. But the real transformation was happening in people's minds, in their understanding of what was possible. "Will you stay?" Sarah asked Chen as he began reorganizing his shop, restoring it from a fortress to a place of trade. "Silver Creek could use someone like you." The merchant's slight smile carried a hint of mystery. "For a while, until the next place needs what I have to teach. But remember, I'm just one thread in a much larger pattern. The guild's work never really ends." In the days following the Blackwater Riders' defeat, Silver Creek became something of a pilgrimage site. Lawmen, merchants, and curious onlookers arrived daily, all hoping to glimpse the man who had single-handedly dismantled the territory's most feared gang. They found instead a simple shop, where Chen conducted business as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. "Ain't natural," one visiting sheriff commented to Bradley. "Man with skills like that could make a fortune as a gun for hire, or clean up half the territories as a lawman." Bradley, watching Chen haggle good-naturedly with a local farmer over the price of tea, simply smiled. "That's what makes him dangerous," the Silver Creek sheriff replied. "He doesn't want power or fame. Makes him impossible to bribe, impossible to threaten. Men like that, they change the world without even trying." The guild representatives had departed, carrying their detailed records back to San Francisco, but their presence left a lasting mark. Martinez had spent his final day teaching Cooper more advanced techniques, while Chang had left Dr. Hayes with a comprehensive text on Chinese medicine, translated into English. More subtly, other changes began to manifest. Word spread through criminal circles about the fate of the Blackwater Riders. The story grew with each telling, a single merchant who could appear like smoke, strike like lightning, and defeat 30 men without killing most of them. The very precision of his violence made it more terrifying than simple bloodshed. 3 gangs have already moved their operations further east, Cooper reported during one quiet evening. "Seems nobody wants to risk crossing paths with the guild. They're not sure how many more like you are out there." Chen, teaching the deputy a particularly complex movement from the snake's fang style, nodded approvingly. "Fear of the unknown is more powerful than fear of violence. The guild has always understood this." Sarah McAllister had begun cataloging her husband's journals, discovering that his observations about Chinese martial arts were part of a larger correspondence with merchants and warriors across the world. He was helping to build this, she realized. Even back then, people were working to create something new, a different kind of justice for a changing world. In his cell at Fort Harrison, awaiting trial, Morrison received visitors from other gangs seeking to understand what had happened. His warnings became almost prophetic. "The frontier's changing," he told them. "The day of the outlaw is ending, not with a bang, but with a whisper. These merchants, they're like ghosts among us, waiting to strike." Tucker, whose testimony would eventually help convict his former boss, found an unexpected new purpose. Released into Chen's custody, the old outlaw began learning the basics of legitimate trade. "Frontier's getting civilized," he observed. "Might as well learn to change with it." Chen himself seemed unchanged by his victory, but those who watched closely noticed how he was subtly preparing the town for his eventual departure. He taught Cooper more each day, shared medical knowledge with Hayes, and worked with Sarah to establish new trading connections that would help Silver Creek prosper. "You're building something here," Bradley said one evening, watching Chen train a small group of townspeople in basic defensive techniques. "Not just teaching us to fight, but showing us a new way to think about protecting what's ours." The merchant paused in his instruction, considering his words carefully. The ancient masters taught that true victory isn't in defeating an enemy, but in creating a situation where enemies become unnecessary. Silver Creek is learning this lesson well. As autumn began to paint the prairie gold, more merchants appeared in town, ordinary traders to all appearances, but each carrying themselves with that same precise awareness that marked Chen's movements. The guild was ensuring that their investment in Silver Creek would continue to bear fruit long after their agent moved on. Before we continue with our story, remember to subscribe if you're enjoying this tale of the ghost merchant. Now let us return to Silver Creek as autumn deepens and change rides on the prairie wind. Winter was approaching when the first serious test of Chen's legacy arrived in Silver Creek. A group of Montana rustlers, having heard of the Blackwater Riders' defeat but skeptical of the tales, decided to probe the town's defenses. They found something unexpected. Not just Chen, but an entire community prepared to protect itself with calculated precision. Deputy Cooper, leading the town's response, demonstrated how thoroughly he had absorbed his mentor's teachings. The rustlers found themselves outmaneuvered and disarmed, with minimal bloodshed. Their own techniques turned against them just as Chen had done with Morrison's gang. "It's like watching ripples spread in a pond," Sarah observed to Chen as they watched Cooper orchestrate the rustlers' surrender. "Everything you've taught us, everything you've shown us, it's changing more than just Silver Creek." The merchant nodded, a hint of satisfaction in his usually neutral expression. "The guild believes that true change must grow naturally, like a seed taking root. Force it and it dies. Nurture it properly, and it transforms the landscape." Dr. Hayes had begun incorporating Chinese medical techniques into his practice, finding that the combination of Eastern and Western approaches saved lives that might have been lost to either tradition alone. Word spread, bringing other frontier doctors to learn from him, each carrying these lessons back to their own communities. Even Tucker, the reformed outlaw, had found his calling. His intimate knowledge of criminal operations, combined with Chen's teachings about precision and control, made him an invaluable advisor to Sheriff Bradley. "Funny thing," Tucker mused one evening. "Spent my whole life thinking power came from causing fear. Now I'm learning it comes from managing it." The trial of Blackjack Morrison and his surviving men became something of a sensation in the territories. Witnesses from Silver Creek testified about the precision with which Chen had disabled rather than killed his opponents, leading to unprecedented discussions about the nature of justice and necessary force. "This ain't just about one gang anymore," Bradley told Chen as they watched another group of curious visitors arrive in town. "You've started something here. People are beginning to question whether the old way of doing things, shooting first and asking questions later, is really the only way." Chen's response was typically measured. "When the guild first began adapting our ancient arts to the modern world, many thought we were betraying tradition. They didn't understand that the greatest tradition is adaptation itself, finding new ways to express timeless truths." The wooden box containing Chen's modified revolvers had become something of a legend itself. Visitors would stare at it, wondering about its contents, but Chen never displayed the weapons unnecessarily. "Tools," he would say when asked, "are only as good as the wisdom behind their use." As the first snow-dusted Silver Creek, change continued to manifest in subtle ways. The town's merchants, inspired by Chen's example, began forming their own trading association, based on principles of mutual protection and shared knowledge. The guild's influence was spreading not through force but through example. "You'll be leaving soon, won't you?" Sarah asked one cold morning, finding Chen practicing his forms behind the shop. The merchant paused, his breath visible in the crisp air. "My work here is nearly complete," he acknowledged. "But the guild never truly leaves a place it has touched. Watch the trading caravans that pass through. You'll learn to recognize the signs, to see our presence in the spaces between obvious things." His words carried the weight of prophecy. Silver Creek was becoming more than just another frontier town. It was transforming into a model of what civilization could look like, when wisdom guided strength, when precision replaced brute force. The first major snowfall of the season blanketed Silver Creek in pristine white, softening the harsh edges of the frontier town, and bringing with it a sense of transformation. For Chen, it marked the approaching end of his time there. The guild had sent word, Other territories needed his particular skills. Other lessons waited to be taught. Word of his imminent departure spread through the town like wildfire, bringing with it a mixture of anxiety and determination. Cooper, now proficient in the basics of the snake's fang style, found himself spending every spare moment with Chen, absorbing final lessons that went far beyond mere combat techniques. The greatest weapon, Chen told his student during one such session, is not the gun, not even the skill behind it. It's the ability to read situations, to understand the flow of events before they unfold. That's what the snake's fang truly teaches, not just how to strike, but when and why. Sarah McAllister had been compiling everything she'd learned about the guild's operations, combining her husband's journals with her own observations. They're building a network, she explained to Sheriff Bradley. Not just of merchants and warriors, but of knowledge itself. Every town like ours becomes a node in that network, a point where civilization gains a foothold. Bradley nodded thoughtfully. Been noticing changes in how other towns handle trouble. Word spreading about what happened here. Not just about Chen's fighting skills, but about the precision of it all. Had 3 sheriffs write me last week, asking about our methods. Dr. Hayes had begun training an apprentice in the combined medical techniques he'd learned, ensuring that this knowledge, too, would remain after Chen's departure. It's remarkable, he told Chen during their final consultation. We thought we were just getting a merchant, but you've brought us a renaissance of sorts. Even Tucker, the reformed outlaw, had found his place in the new order. His understanding of criminal operations, combined with Chen's teachings about precision and control, made him an invaluable advisor to law enforcement across the territory. Funny thing, he mused, watching snow fall outside the jail. Used to think fear was power. Now I understand. Real power is in knowing when not to use it. As the day of departure approached, Chen began transferring his legitimate business connections to other merchants in town, ensuring Silver Creek's prosperity would continue. But his most important legacy wasn't in trade routes or fighting techniques. It was in the way the town had learned to think differently about power and justice. You've taught us more than just self-defense, Sarah told him one evening. You've shown us that civilization doesn't have to mean weakness, that refinement can be more powerful than brutality. Chen's response was characteristic in its wisdom. The guild believes that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the precision with which we can shape events. Silver Creek understands this now. You've learned to be surgical in your use of force, diplomatic in your dealings, strategic in your thinking. The night before his planned departure, the town gathered in the church for what everyone understood was a final lesson. Chen stood before them, his presence as commanding as ever, though he spoke barely above a whisper. What happened here with the Blackwater Riders was not just about one battle, one victory. It was about showing a different path forward. The frontier doesn't have to be won through brute force alone. Precision, wisdom, and control. These are the tools that will build the future. As he spoke, snow continued to fall outside, covering the last visible traces of the battle that had transformed Silver Creek. But the real changes, the ones that mattered, were carved not in the earth but in the minds and hearts of those who had witnessed the ghost merchant's tale. Dawn broke crystal clear on the day of Chen's departure, the rising sun painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of rose and gold. The entire town had gathered to bid farewell to the man who had transformed their community, though many suspected this wouldn't be the last they'd see of the guild's influence. Before mounting his wagon, Chen conducted one final inspection of his legacy. Deputy Cooper demonstrated the complete form of the dragon's scales, his movements fluid and precise. Dr. Hayes presented his compiled notes on the fusion of Eastern and Western medicine. Sarah McAllister showed him the newly established Merchants' Council, organized according to guild principles. Remember, Chen told them, his quiet voice carrying in the crisp morning air, what you've learned here isn't just about defense or trading. It's about understanding that true power lies in precision, in control, in knowing how to shape events rather than simply react to them. Sheriff Bradley, watching the proceedings with his characteristic thoughtfulness, finally asked the question that had been on many minds. The Guild, how many more like you are out there teaching these lessons? Chen's slight smile carried volumes of meaning. Enough. The frontier is vast, but so is our patience. Every town like Silver Creek becomes a beacon, showing others that there's a different way forward. The day of the crude outlaw is ending, though some may take longer to learn this than others. As if to emphasize his point, a rider galloped into town, bringing news that would have once caused panic, but now inspired only calm preparation. A new gang had formed in the Nebraska Territory, thinking to fill the void left by the Blackwater Riders' defeat. They'll come testing soon enough, Cooper predicted, his hand unconsciously moving through one of Chen's defensive positions. Might need some guidance when they do. You won't need me for that, Chen replied confidently. Silver Creek knows how to handle such things now. Watch the trading caravans that pass through. You'll find help comes in many forms, often when least expected but most needed. Sarah approached with a package, her husband's journals, combined with her own observations of recent events. For the Guild's records, she explained. So others can learn from what happened here. Chen accepted the gift with a respectful bow. Your husband would be proud of how Silver Creek has grown. You've all learned perhaps the most important lesson, that civilization isn't about subduing the frontier through force, but about transforming it through wisdom. As Chen prepared to depart, Tucker approached for a final word. The reformed outlaw had become a symbol of the very transformation Chen had brought to Silver Creek. You know what's funny? Tucker mused. Morrison thought you broke him that day, but really you showed all of us, a better way. Some of us were just smart enough to learn from it. The wagon rolled out of Silver Creek as the morning sun climbed higher, Chen's black coat cutting a distinctive silhouette against the winter landscape. But those who watched him leave knew this wasn't really an ending. In the months and years that followed, other merchants would pass through town, some carrying familiar wooden boxes, others moving with that same fluid grace that marked them as students of the ancient arts. Silver Creek itself became something of a legend in the territories, a place where justice was served with surgical precision, where violence was controlled rather than celebrated, where civilization advanced not through brute force, but through careful calculation. The tale of Marcus Swift Hand Chen and his transformation of Silver Creek became more than just another frontier story. It became a parable about change itself, about how true power lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the precision with which one can shape the future. And somewhere out there, on the vast American frontier, a humble merchant's wagon rolled on toward the next town that needed its particular brand of enlightenment, carried by a man who had mastered the art of trading not just in goods, but in justice itself.